So we're transitioning to how does this show up today? Okay, and so I thought it was very important for me to show you those pieces that we didn't get to. But today we're going to be talking about systematic racism. Um, Today, what the system of race that was created back then, the socialization of Black people being inferior, being beastly, being unintelligent, being criminals, being someone you cannot trust, all have consequences that we're living with today. Like I said, it's the fruit. Those fruits come in the form of microaggressions that I'm not going to get into right now. We're going to talk about that later on. Racial profiling and aggressive policing. I don't know of a male my age that has not had a negative encounter with the police. Not one. Not a Black male my age that hasn't had a negative encounter with the police. The experiences that the majority of white Americans have with the police is completely different than the experiences of Black Americans. And because the experiences are different, for some people, it's hard for them to understand, or relate to what all the anger is about. Internalized self-hatred. This is something that in the breakout rooms I'm going to get more into, but internalized self-hatred is when Black people ourselves begin to internalize negative messages about us, and then we begin to engage in destructive behaviors because the fact that we hate who we are. Systematic discriminations in job, housing, education, and economics. And so that is what we're going to be talking about today. Systematic racism. Systematic racism, the BAR program that we have at the school, I've gotten this information from some of their materials. Systematic racism is organizations or systems intentionally or unintentionally maintain the support of the dominant culture. So intentionally or unintentionally maintain and support the dominant culture. That's the purpose. Sometimes the systems are so closed to people of color, they keep people from joining or feeling a part of the whole through rules and expectations. But today we're going to be talking more about the blatant exclusion of people of color in those systems.
We need to talk about race. Why are people protesting? Why are people angry? Slavery ended 150 years ago. The civil rights movement was 60 years ago. Racial discrimination is illegal now. Heck, we even had a Black president. So why are people still upset? We're going to go through history and we're going to look at some data, and we're going to go quickly so this video doesn't get too long. So hang on. These are two households in America. One is Black, the other is white. Today, the average Black household has 60% of the income of the average white household, but only 1/10 of the household wealth. Why does that matter? Well, household wealth helps send kids to school, helps launch small businesses, stabilizes loss of income, and helps families survive catastrophic events like divorce or unemployment. What's amazing about this number is that there are lots of extremely wealthy African Americans, movie stars, pop stars, 75% of the NBA, 70% of the NFL, Oprah, Tyler Perry, Ben Carson, Morgan Freeman, and there are a lot of extremely poor white families. Think of Appalachia and other parts of rural America. But even when we factor all that in, the average Black household still has only 1/10 the wealth of the average white household. How did that happen? Well, here we go. What happened after we freed the slaves, after the Civil War ended? 9 states enacted vagrancy laws, making it a crime to not have a job. The law was applied only to Black men. 8 of those states then allowed prisoners, the black men who'd just been arrested for not having a job, to be hired out to plantation owners with little or no pay going to the prisoners themselves. So, that's right, men who had been freed from the plantations found themselves right back on the plantations. Additional laws prohibited mischief and insulting gestures, which allowed more black men to be arrested and created a huge market for convict leasing. Working conditions for these leased convicts could be worse than slavery because the plantation owner leasing the black prisoner had no long-term interest in his well-being. By the turn of the 20th century, every state in the South had mandated racial segregation by law, Jim Crow laws, which supported a social ostracism for blacks that extended to schools, churches, housing, jobs, restrooms, hotels and restaurants, hospitals, prisons, funeral homes, morgues, and cemeteries. White politicians competed with each other to be more strict and specific on segregation. For example, a law prohibiting blacks and whites from playing chess together. No interracial chess playing. That might lead to lawn darts. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that these Jim Crow laws were perfectly legal because they, quote, reflected customs and traditions and, quote, preserved public peace and good order. These laws stayed in place until 1954, when the idea of separate but equal was struck down in the ruling known as Brown versus Board of Education. So what happened next after Brown? Well, in 1956, the Southern Manifesto was signed by 101 out of 128 Congress members from the South, pledging to maintain Jim Crow by all means possible. 5 states passed nearly 50 new Jim Crow laws after 1954. Private whites-only schools, dubbed segregation academies, popped up all across the South, many of them Christian. But now widespread civil rights protests, combined with anti-war protests that were occasionally becoming violent, inspired the political rise of law and order rhetoric. Richard Nixon became the first candidate to campaign specifically on a platform of law and order. In 1968, 81% of Americans agreed that law and order had broken down in this country, and the majority blamed communists and Negroes who start riots. Let's go back to household wealth. The average black...
So it's hard for me to like present and look at comments at the same time. I did have an opportunity just to kind of peek at some of the comments. So really quickly, just as a reminder that yes, oppression, discrimination is broad, right? I told you in a first class that if you look at in this country as a history of immigration, I'll call it the cycle of intolerance. Almost every group, until they were able to assimilate, right, into the main society, experience some type of discrimination, right? Also, other racial groups experienced discrimination. I told you that the Native Americans were the first slaves, right? Mexicans experienced and still experiencing a lot of discrimination. The Japanese Americans and the Chinese Americans. The Japanese Americans were placed in internment camps, right? The Chinese built our railroads, but we refused to give them citizenship and then shipped Chinese back to China after they were done building our railroads. But for this presentation, I'm focusing on the history of race in this country, the history of race in America. I know some of the terms like picnic may have other meanings and other origins outside of the United States, but in the United States, that is where that term derived. So it also until 1950s, there was only 2 racial categories, white and black. So regardless if you was from a different ethnicity, you were considered to be black if you was not white. And so Um, so from that standpoint, you know, if someone is asking, well, why is he just kind of focusing on blacks? Well, for two reasons. One, because the 1950s, that's all we had was white and black. And two, there's has not been a group outside of the Native Americans that has been systematically targeted towards race and separation as Black people have. The civil rights movement opened up the doors, even though the civil rights movement was, the movement was originated due to Black oppression. It opened up the doors to all minority groups that were being discriminated against. So that's the reason why I'm focusing mainly on Black people.